Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hope you're all having an amazing day. I will take a moment to plug a second video that I've uploaded today, and that is detailing how T-flops are calculated and what they actually are in relation to the next generation consoles, and also discussing things such as the GPU architecture, RDNA 2 and 3 feature sets in the next generation consoles, and several other really cool topics as well. So once again, plug. Anyway, moving on to today's news, we have several interesting things that I'd like to go through. The first of which is AMD have given CPR to Polaris for the 100th time, maybe 102nd, I'm not sure at this point. In China, they have released a new RX 590, and it is the GME, which is featuring the Polaris 20 XTX die. Now, this particular GPU is not being well received in the markets where it's released in, because the best way I can describe this GPU is a rebrand of the RX 580. Indeed, the RX 580 has a boost clock of 1340 MHz, whereas the 590 GME hits 1380. Bear in mind that the rest of the core configuration is identical, so 2304 shaders. It's been the same all the way back to the RX 480. And as for the 590, which is the highest end Polaris SKU, we have a boost clock of 1545 MHz. Of course, the caveat here is it does depend on custom AIB models. Some will be a little bit faster, some will be slower, and so on and so on. And bear in mind that this is not the first time that we've seen AMD release kind of rebrands or multiple variants of the same SKU. We've seen the RX 580 2048 SP, which is basically the RX 570. And this is not AMD doing this in isolation. Nvidia have certainly been guilty of doing much the same, and it's not cool when they do it, and it is not cool when AMD do it. I'll link to an EXP review, or is it EX preview? I'm uncertain which. I guess it's EXP review article where they actually review the card. They basically, I can't describe it any other way other than give up halfway through, because it's like kind of reviewing the RX 580 again. There's pretty much no performance difference. Obviously, an overclocking will be handled pretty much the same as well. While we be on the subject of AMD, we finally have an image of a B550 motherboard. This comes courtesy of videocards.com, where YCry over there actually got emailed a photo of the board. This is one of those products where, honestly, if it takes much longer for it to go into mass circulation, they might as well just call it the B650. It's kind of ridiculous. Now, to be clear, AMD did launch the B550A, which is essentially a refresh of the B450, but it's only available to system integrators. So, if you're purchasing a system from the Dells of the world, great. Otherwise, no. To be fair, I'm not sure if Dell actually has a system which has this particular, or has a B550A, so I might be telling you a load of horse crap there. But anyway, as for the B550 board, it's pretty much the B450, albeit with PCIe 4 support, but only for the primary slot, which is directly connected to the CPU, which is obviously one of the cuts. So, clearly this board is great, all these boards are great if you are kind of wanting to future-proof yourself somewhat. And I say it in such a way because it's like, GPUs I don't think are going to be really taking advantage of PCIe 4 for some time. And I suspect that people who buy one of these boards, maybe I'm wrong, but people who buy one of these boards are probably not going to want to rush out and buy like RTX 3080 Ti, assuming it supports PCIe 4, I assume it will, and the highest, latest and greatest AMD GPU. There's actually a review I put on the channel quite recently from BioStar, and it's for an X570 motherboard, which is actually super cheap. It's probably going to be roughly in the same price range, honestly, as many of these B550 motherboards. And in terms of feature set, it's not much different. So if you are looking for a cheap 500 series board, which does have PCIe, you can check out my review or someone else's review of the board. It's pretty solid, albeit with the obvious concessions of a cheaper board. It doesn't have, 5 trillion different M.2 slots and so on. But otherwise, it's a pretty solid board. So if you are looking to purchase a motherboard which does have PCIe 4 and you don't want a higher end board, then that may be one option for you in the meanwhile. Next up, I really want to bring your attention to a new standard that Intel are trying to roll into the PC market space. And this is actually really cool, at least in my opinion, particularly for those who are stickler for cable management. You should definitely be all for this. They are redesigning and trying to push the ATX12VO standard. Gordon over at PC World did a really great write-up with this, so I'll of course link his article in the video description, which goes into much more detail. But the too long didn't read is that PSUs nowadays are way more efficient than what they used to be, but also the way components now utilize voltages in computers is also very different to what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Back in the day, there was a lot more usage on the 5 and 3.3 volt rails compared to what we have now, whereas the way that modern day CPUs function with the way phases work on motherboards, it essentially takes the 12 volt rail from your CPU, and then the more phases you have, basically it converts it into cleaner power. I actually had a really great interview regarding this with MSI and a couple of their engineers. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description, but if not, you can search for MSI interview on the channel. But too long didn't read. 12 volts is basically what drives the CPU now on your motherboard, and of course 3.3 and 5 volts do have their place with certain components. And obviously things like, your SSD or your hard drive, that type of thing, those components are still not using 12 volts. But, with that said, the downside to this is that, of course, modern day PSUs have a really, really thick main power cable. It's like 24 pin, right? The ATX, this new ATX standard, will shift things around, and instead it's going to just be down to 10 pins, which is actually really cool. Theoretically speaking, this would significantly improve efficiency of the power supply, but furthermore, it would reduce the complexity and potentially the cost, and maybe even the size of the PSU as well. This is also according to PSU vendors like Corsair, who are of course extremely well respected. Now, that isn't to say that this is not without downsides, and as I mentioned a moment ago, certain components do require the use of lower voltages, so obviously some rethinking would be done in the future for these components, but still, I'm kind of all for it, if only for the cable management side of the equation. It looks like the current plan is, at least to my understanding, that instead it would be essentially connected onto the motherboard. So this would theoretically mean motherboards are more expensive, but at the very least for people who are pushing towards smaller form factor systems, or maybe if you just want to go with the whole M.2 route, this may not be such a big deal anyway, because once again you're going to be cutting down, your cabling. As I mentioned, I will link in the video description this article. I think it's really cool, and I think it's pretty positive of Intel to do this. Speaking of Intel, though, there's a really fascinating rumour doing the rounds, and this concerns Intel's Alder Lake processors. And it is, of course, a rumour, so I'd preface this by saying, pinch of salt, may not turn out to be true, so on and so on and so on. But you may be familiar with big. LITTLE architecture. Basically, you have higher power CPU cores, which are designed for more complicated tasks, but if you're doing something that's not really taxing, for example, you're just kind of browsing the web or strolling around Facebook, which may be more mentally taxing, to be honest with you, then obviously the smaller, lower power CPU cores will take over. Well, there's kind of something interesting here, because Alder Lake S, according to a leak which has been circulating on the internet, which has been spotted by a couple of people, including Momomo and Ghost Motley, I'll link them in the video description, it seems to indicate that Intel's future Alder Lake S, so S of course means it's a desktop part, may feature a big little design, which means it would have Golden Cove processor cores and potentially even Gracemont, although the exact configuration is at best ambiguous. Now the target TDP is 125 watts so far, but apparently Intel are internally investigating up to 150 watts. And you'll notice that it says 8 plus 8 plus 1 in this particular image, which is because it has 8 big cores, 8 smaller cores, and then obviously you've got the GT1 for graphics. And this will be on the LGA 1700 socket, assuming, of course, this is right. Now, what's interesting about the LGA 1700 socket is you may recall a leak from earlier this year from Intel. Funnily enough, first doing the rounds because of Momomo and also Komachi, that of course we will see the shift from 1151 pins, which we currently have, to 1200 for the next generation Intel parts, the 10th generation, and 1700 pins after that. But according to Komachi, the actual physical dimensions of the chip will also change as well. He believes that Alder Lake S will be 45 by 37.5 mm, and once again to reiterate, it will be on the LGA 1700 socket. Now I did speak to Komachi about this a little bit in DM, and I actually went more extensively into this in another video where I went into analysis of what Intel will most likely do on the desktop for competing against AMD, because don't forget, Zen 3 or Ryzen 4000 will launch this year. But according to all of my sources, it's still going to be 16 processor cores, 32 threads for the higher end, albeit with higher clock frequencies, probably not that much, maybe 100-ish, 200-ish megahertz, but with drastically increased IPC. But the real kick in the shin for Intel could come in the form of Zen 4, because by that point we should see the shift, at least that's what I'm hearing anyway, to DDR5. It looks like AMD are planning to do that for AM5, which is of course going to be the replacement for AM4. Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit to kind of set the stage, because clearly that means that Intel are going to have to kind of do a lot to compete. Forget even the core count, just in terms of IPC, because clearly AMD are not going to be sitting on its butt just watching the world go by. They are being extremely aggressive, and we've seen that now enforced in multiple different conferences from AMD, that they are not going to just sit back and kind of enjoy their success. They are going to be as aggressive as possible pursuing performance. So, speaking to Komachi and a couple of others as well, but they definitely don't want to be named, they believe that there is multiple dies on the LGA 1700, but at the time the confusion was, well, is it an MCM, in other words multiple x86 cores, we'll call them big cores just to clarify and make things really simple in terms of verbiage, or was it a really big graphics core, or was that information false, or what's going on? Well, potentially, and this is just a theory on my part, spitballing, but maybe the big cores are on one die and the smaller cores are on another, although I would assume that would be some latency associated with that, but of course we don't have a block diagram to know exactly how all of this is connected, most likely via EMIB. The other question is, what the heck are all of those additional pins for? Because the shift from LGA 1200 to 1700, well, that's 500 extra pins right there. Even if you say that Intel are going to ramp up the number of PCIe lanes and, shifting to PCIe 4, that still would not account for that number of pins. So another theory is maybe that they're integrating yet more features from the PCH onto the CPU, but once again, all of that is just speculation. The final thing I'd like to discuss today is Horizon Zero Dawn is coming to the PC. This has actually been confirmed by Sony themselves. Indeed, the interview with Herman Holst is very interesting. He is the former Guerrilla Games leader. He's now the boss over at Sony's PlayStation Worldwide Studios. A couple of interesting quotes. He said that I can confirm Horizon Zero Dawn is coming to the PC this summer, and there'll be more information coming from Guerrilla. They, by the way, have actually released statements, and now we actually have the Steam page, although the exact release date, at least over the time I'm recording this video, does not seem to be nailed down, so we don't have an exact release date. But he also added that I think it's important that we stay open to new ideas, how to introduce more people to PlayStation, show people maybe what they've been missing out on, to put maybe a few minds at ease. Releasing one first-party AAA game to PC doesn't necessarily mean that every game will come to PC. In my mind, Zero Dawn was just a great fit in this particular instance, and we don't have plans for date PC releases, but we remain 100% committed to dedicated hardware. Essentially, what he's saying, of course, is that he wants to tantalise PC gamers with the odd game probably later on down the line. But it also is a smart move from Sony in multiple ways. One, it gets them more monies, which is obviously always good, but it also is a great way to promote future games which are coming out on the platform. I'm almost positive that we're going to see like Horizon Zero Dawn 2 and other titles, and from what I've been told through the grapevine, I've discussed this in a couple of videos previously exclusively, Sony have already demos of internally of Horizon Zero Dawn running with ray tracing technology, which they're showing off to some people, and apparently it looks amazing. There's also been some other games that they've been testing as well, and it looks astounding. Whether we're going to see RTX technology for the Horizon Zero Dawn for PC, who the hell knows. I think it would look amazing if it did, but also I think it just makes sense for the grander scheme of things, get as many people's eyes on the games as humanly possible. So yeah, I think it's going to be really cool to play Horizon Zero Dawn on PC. I think Sony and Microsoft need to monetize their software the best they can, and I wouldn't be surprised if we did see other games, like potentially even Spider-Man, and a couple of other titles make their way to PC as well. I don't think, however, we're at that point where you're going to see like a new release from Sony simultaneously launching on the PC, with exceptions like Street Fighter V, which of course was partially funded by Sony but also got a simultaneous PC release. But I think we're going to kind of see the same situation with some games like we've seen with Death Stranding or Horizon Zero Dawn, where if you're a PC gamer and you're willing to wait, well, you'll eventually get to play the experience. On the other hand, if you've just played, just for example, Horizon Zero Dawn, and you just are like, well, I really want to play the new one, you may be tempted to kind of cough up and get into the PlayStation ecosystem. If not, I guess Sony are just kind of thinking, well, we might as well get the money from the person, because they would never actually have had that experience, would never have made the money anyway, so we might as well make it some way or another. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you did, then the normal stuff, like, share, comment and subscribe. I'm also going to plug my other video today, so plug, check it out, plug, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.